So I'd like to see how many of you have been feeling this week what I mentioned earlier, that somehow spiritual practice doesn't have to be Buddhism or mindfulness, anything, just any kind of connection to your sort of meaning-making structures, your relationship to the spiritual realm or the existential realm. How many people have felt disconnected, as if that doesn't hold as much realness as what our country went through? Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you for being honest about that. I had some of that, as I mentioned, as well. All of a sudden, the practice seemed kind of like a luxury. And in some respects, there was this essence of dharma and the teachings being like the illusory reflections of the moon and water. Intangible. Under the weight of the realness of our social and political situation and the ramifications of that for the future. That was interesting because it takes a lot to make me feel that way, since most of my life is in the flow of the things that we talk about. At least I try to keep them front and center. After all, it is the umbrella under which everything I do exists. There's really no separation. And I think this is a wonderful example, a wonderful opportunity to say, okay, part of this is, for me anyway, and you can tell me what your experience has been. But for me, it was like, great, this is the challenge that we find in the Lojong teachings. Taking the difficulties onto the path. And the first difficulty for me was, they're not related. The path is not related to this. That was the illusion. That was the illusion. That was the doubt, the fifth hindrance in mindfulness. It doesn't mean the answer is easy or should be readily available because we've cultivated ourselves into a state of ubiquitous wisdom all the time. I would that were so, but for many of us, that's not the case. So there is still work to do internally. There's still work to do in our society, naturally, no matter who won the election. So let's go back. Let's go all the way back to the time of the Buddha in the 5th, 6th century BCE, and look at what he encountered among some of the leaders and the rulers. Things were not pretty then. There were people, however, who were very much moved by the Buddhist teachings at that time. Kings of smaller realms, yeah? Now, at the time, there was this caste, the class of the Brahmin priests, that often clashed philosophically with the Buddhists. And as the sort of the authoritative Hindu Brahmin often would do, is if there was sort of a new sect arising, they would check it out. They wouldn't just categorically dismiss it, but they would check it out and see, is there merit to this? And if there were, they would basically take them into the fold. And this is what has led to the six darshanas, the logicians of Nyaya, the Vedanta, the early Vedanta, the seal of the Vedas, became really sort of instituted in a much more formal way, based on the Upanishadic teachings. You had the Purva Mimamsa, you had the Samkhya and the yoga philosophies, all of which probably were so well preserved because they became really important and central to Indian religions. But Buddhism didn't quite enjoy that. And it's interesting, it's one of the traditions that didn't sort of get incorporated into the fold, if you will. So the context here is that there were Brahmin, There were kings, there were small and large, what we might call states or provinces, regions, and teachers who were very unorthodox. And then you had the Buddha. And so you had this multiplicity of things. You had a tremendous amount of poverty, caste, all of these things, which you still do. And this prompted the Buddha to focus in on how a good leader actually can embody the teachings of the Dharma. And so there's a sutra, the Chakravarthi, that's the Pali term, Chakravarthi Sutta. It's in the Nikayas, some of the later sutras. Chakravarthi is the Pali, the Sanskrit term is Chakravarthi. Chakravarthi, the wheel turner. The wheel turners were the leaders of areas and regions who, like the Buddha, had grown up in great prosperity in a royal family. And so he was seen to be one of them in many ways. Basically, what the Buddha taught was that two things are absolutely essential for the wheel turner, the leader who is the wheel turner of a society. Number one, economic stability, which includes no one living in abject poverty. Basically an egalitarian, a somewhat egalitarian, what we might call nowadays a basic universal income. People who are really poor need to be helped, not just talked at, right? So economic stability for all people in a region. Because without that, you can't have the second thing, which is peace. The Buddha spoke about this frequently. That if people are living in poverty, what happens? They begin to steal. And then you have a choice. You can either say, here is money. Oh, this is in the sutra. Here is money for you to go off and meet your basic needs and provide for your family. Basically, like it wasn't a micro loan, it was more of a gift, if you will, but it was more of an investment into a peaceful society. Or what began to happen in one of the sutras was people would hear, oh, the king is giving out free money to those of us who are poor. Let's all go and get our share of it. And then they would go back and get more. And so you start seeing in this sutra just the basically the what we might call people who are taking advantage, as opposed to using the opportunity to begin providing for their families and such. So the king saw, okay, this is a little, this isn't necessarily a fix to the situation. And so instead, he began to basically put the thieves, the people who were stealing, instead of giving them money, putting them in jail. Let's see how this goes. And what happens? It was not a deterrent. Deterrence was not a thing that worked. In fact, instead, what it caused was people would pick up swords. So in the sutra, this notion of, well, so the king was in this dilemma because now he had not just full jails, but he had people who were now taking up arms against the king. This went totally against, on both ends, it went against the teachings of the Buddha. So this is a dilemma. This is not easily solvable. And so basically the ruler is left with a really hard challenge here, providing for all the people. And if there is unrest, it's the ruler that is represented by the unrest, because the people are doing what people do, yeah, when they are stretched. So the wheel turners began to apply the principles of Dharma that relied on the precepts, not stealing, not killing, not engaging in sexual misconduct, not engaging in the misuse of intoxicants, not lying, not basically not lying to the people. And so they were really bound to the Buddha's teachings. This is another term for these wheel turners, these leaders, was called the universal monarch. What's interesting in the stories is that there was always a period of prosperity and well-being that then devolved into decline, where things got really bad. And the leaders, insofar as they in some way may have been responsible, a lot of this was also due to what we call collective karma, which that is not in the sutra. But when you start reading the circumstances, the ages, if you will, there are these natural periods where unrest happens. When things get too good, then they start to decline again for some reason, until somebody comes in and figures it out, rules benevolently. And what we start seeing in the sutras is that these leaders who are wheel turners, actually things get better for everyone. And then if things get out of balance, or somebody else fulfills that role who hasn't embodied the principles already, things decline. And so you have this back and forth. You see the dilemma here, even during the Buddha's time, between these situations. This is not just a problem of our age. Yes, we, I think, are in a long, long arc of a process. And it's always going to be changing one way or another. Another interesting example is the Dalai Lama, several years ago, was hard pressed by some of his people in exile, the Tibetans in exile in India, Nepal, Sikkim, other places, who wanted to take arms against the Chinese government. Basically, we want to go back into the Tibetan plateau and start taking back what is rightfully ours. And they wanted the Dalai Lama's blessing to do this, to use violence. And the Dalai Lama said, His Holiness, he said, if you do this, I will step down as your political leader. I will no longer be the leader of the Tibetan people. This is not the way. Yeah. Eventually he did. It doesn't mean that there has been an insurgency there against the Chinese government necessarily using arms, but he got some hot water. He got in hot water for that by a number of people, for being what some of us might call a pacifist. But he knew that was not the answer. Rather, the Dalai Lama has spoken out about the collective karma among the Tibetan people that led to their ostracization. That would be very, very hard to hear. And yet, I feel like some of that can also be a reflection, perhaps, of where we are. The collective karma. That doesn't mean that each of us is responsible in the way that we might think, because individual karma is that which we are responsible for through our sense of motivation. But we are perhaps surrounded by communities and groups of people who have a common purpose. And this is what defines collective karma, a common purpose, common motivation, as well as patterns of fear, of anger, of insufficiency, of scarcity, all of these things. There is also another thing I'll share with you. What was helpful for me was the story of Avalokiteshwara. There's the ancient myth of the great bodhisattva of compassion. Earlier, before we started our session, I was playing the the Om Mani Padme Hum mantra by the Gyuro monks and Deva Premal. That's the mantra of Avalokiteshwara, the jewel at the heart of the lotus, the boundlessness of his compassion. As a bodhisattva, Avalokiteshvara vows not to take the final step into full enlightenment until all beings are liberated from suffering. And so, as such, he turns back towards the world and even goes deep into the hell realms to try to liberate the suffering souls in the hell realms, and works tirelessly, freeing through his just boundless compassion, his love. He also is said to weep on behalf of the suffering we experience. He is moved, so as a compassionate being with immeasurable empathy. He's very much moved. He feels the pain. And finally, the hell realms are empty. They're empty. They're just, you have this sense in reading the story of this satisfaction, of this feeling of, okay, I think I'm good. I think we're all finally there. We're all good. At last, we've arrived. And he turns and looks, and all of a sudden, those hell realms are full of beings once more. And in the story, there's a moment of despair. Even Avalokiteshvara, he has a moment of WTF. This sense of, oh my gosh. So even that, he shares with us. Oh my gosh, we're not there yet. So what does he do? Well, he grows 1,000 arms, 100 heads. If you've ever seen images of Avalokiteshvara with all of these arms, each of the arms represents a skillful mean or skillful means appropriate for the ones that he is seeking to liberate. In other words, he's not just doing one thing at this point. He's nuancing. He is, as we say in chaplaincy, he's person-centered. So he has unlimited amounts of skill sets and tools to be able to go to any being he finds and convey that aspiration of love and wisdom. Love and wisdom, both of them matter here for skillful means. You can't have one without the other. And to this day, he's still working in that realm to liberate sentient beings. So that situation, this ancient myth, this story of Avalokiteshvara really spoke to me on Wednesday morning. And it put things into perspective. You know, there are people who know well how it feels to be oppressed. African Americans, 400 years. I've talked to so many this week on campus who have said, well, we've had to put up with 400 years. We know what it feels like. How many of us can say that? The long arc. The long arc. The despair and the perseverance, the virya, the 6 perfections that we have occasionally talked about. One of them is perseverance. Yeah. And as the great Logchenpa tells us, rather than waiting for everything to be perfect before we can practice, before we can feel like we have a path, he says, don't wait for that, but rather bring freedom into reality. Bring your freedom into reality as opposed to waiting for reality to allow you freedom. That's part of the work here. And we do this together. We do this together. We don't have to do this alone. We don't have to do this separately. And that's, I think, the importance of Sangha here. So